You're listening to the Same My Angler, and my daddy is the host.
All right, best intro ever. My name is Rick Crawford. I am the host, also known as Dada around these parts, but I'm the host of The Sustainable Angler. For those of you who may be listening for the first time, this is a podcast created to inspire anglers to protect the planet. And I am really stoked about our guest today, who is Dr. Andy Danylchuk. For those not familiar, Andy is the professor of fish conservation at UMass Amherst. He's a fellow for the Explorers Club. He's a research fellow for Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. He's a science advisor for Keep Fish Wet and an ambassador for brands like Patagonia. So goes without saying, Andy is very well qualified to talk about fisheries conservation on the show today. And we take a deep dive into some of Andy's background, but also how climate change is impacting our fisheries, how anglers can take action and be more resilient or help our fisheries become more resilient. And also the amazing work he does with Bonefish Tarpon Trust and some of the findings from their research and their studies. I've got tarpon on the brain, have a couple of tarpon trips lined up this year. So anyway, really excited for y'all to hear this interview. Had a lot of fun. Also, wanted to let you know that if you live in Charleston, I'm really psyched that The Sustainable Angler is now available on Ohm Radio, 96.3 FM, airing every Saturday at 2 p.m. So Charleston's only community-supported radio station, psyched to be a part of it. So tune in Saturdays at 2 p.m. This episode of The Sustainable Angler is brought to you by Emerger Strategies. Emerger Strategies is a sustainable business consultancy that helps companies measure and demonstrably improve their sustainability performance year over year, all while boosting profits. To learn more, visit www.emergerstrategies.com.
Hey, Rick, thanks very much. Yeah, and delighted to be on the podcast. And it's been great interacting with you for the last few years. And, obviously there's some common ground in thinking about sustainability in our recreational fisheries and everything in between. And so for people that don't know me, I'm Dr. Andy Danylchuk. I'm a professor of fish conservation at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And that's kind of my day job, where, as a professor, I teach a bunch of courses in fish conservation, fish ecology, recreational fisheries, and other things, and then do a whole bunch of research on lots of different things that are fish related. My background, I grew up in Canada, and did a lot of research on fish populations in Canada, and focusing on things that influence their populations in terms of natural and anthropogenic disturbances. Focused a lot on things like impacts of forest harvesting on fish populations, looked at the impacts of pulp and paper mills on fish populations. Have a pretty deep background in all things kind of fish and aquatic. After finishing my PhD at the University of Alberta, I spent about 10 years in the Bahamian Archipelago, first 2 years in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then the remainder of that time on Eleuthera in the Bahamas, where I had the opportunity to help build a research institute that focuses on sustainability and both on the land and in the sea, this collective idea of living harmoniously with our environments. And then made my way up to UMass in 2009. And since since that move to the Turks and Caicos Islands in 2000, my research focus has shifted a lot towards recreational fisheries. So I do a lot on understanding how fish respond to catch and release. So we'll talk a bit about that today. I do a lot of work on movement ecology. So how fish, and I do some work on sharks, what drives their movement patterns and how do you connect their movement patterns to habitat use, and also what puts them in areas where they might be more threatened by various, environmental disturbances. And so that's sort of where my research has gone for the last 23 years. And I think as an academic, I understand sort of the research side of things. I also grew up fishing. I'm a passionate angler. I love to fish. And, I know a lot of times people say this, that fishing has saved their lives. And it, I have a pretty crazy, nasty, weird past, childhood and everything else. And fishing really actually did save my life. And to be able to focus on fish and as something that I love, and to have my research sort of work on fish conservation and protecting what I love, and helping protect what everybody else loves that likes to go fishing or even eat fish. That's sort of where my career path has gone. And let's see, tied to all that, I know I'm rambling, but you asked for a detailed background, but it's weird because I'm not, for right or wrong, good or bad, I'm not I don't think I'm a typical academic. I look at what a lot of my other colleagues do at UMass, and, they focus on their teaching and their research, and then they write their scientific publications, and that's what they do. And I don't think that's good enough. I think that we need to get the science. We have to be really good at conservation engagement. We have to really be able to be good at taking the complex science and all this other stuff that is really important, but putting it and communicating in a way where people that want to have a powerful voice, and they understand what's going on with fish in their environment. So because of that, and because of, I think, that frame of mind, or at least my drive in that sense, in addition to being a professor. So like I'm a fly fishing ambassador for Patagonia because of the shared values. Obviously that kind of jives based on the stuff that I do with catch and release. I'm the science advisor for Keep Fish Wet, thinking about how I sort of use the science to help support that grassroots conservation movement for understanding how anglers can release fish in the best condition possible. I'm also, for various reasons, I'm on the Science and Policy Committee for the Fisheries Fund, which is a part of the American Fly Fishing Trade Association. I'm on the science panel for the International Game Fish Association, so I understand the non-government organization world and why NGOs are important components in terms of the way we work collaboratively for the future of our fish and aquatic ecosystems. Because of the stuff that I've done internationally and a lot of the exploration work, I'm a fellow national of the Explorers Club. And so understanding how, where some of the places we go that are pristine, or that understanding how there's that connection of integral and visceral exploration in terms of some of the places that we go and the things that we tried to advocate for change. And I know this will come up later in our conversation, then relative to, tarpon and bonefish and permit and other things, for about, I think it's almost 10 years, 9 years, maybe. I've been a research fellow of Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, I guess.
well, in summary, you now understand why I'm excited to interview Dr. Danylchuk here.
Just Andy, just call me Andy. I ask my students call me Andy. The doctor thing is too much of an ivory tower stuff, and I'm not that type of academic. At least I hope I'm not. Well,
regardless, you now know why I wanted to interview Andy, because there could be someone. I don't think we could talk to too many people, or I couldn't talk to or interview too many people that have his particular insights and knowledge. So that's why I'm really excited about this. So there were a few things that you mentioned in the intro that kind of got me thinking, and I've been asking people this in my interviews recently, and it's always a fun one, I think. But so you obviously, I assume you grew up fishing. That's kind of where you fell in love with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so who inspired you, or who were like your conservation heroes that you went from being an angler who, loved to fish to, all right, and now I'm pursuing, a career in protecting these fish?
Yeah. I grew up watching, Jacques Cousteau, and I grew up watching, those shows about, and maybe that's where my interest in exploring and really thinking about the natural history, like our connection with the fish and the environment, and thinking about the way they behave and just cool observations of the world, and hope at a time when maybe it wasn't being messed up so much. And so I remember spending a lot of time thinking about, and I would say that would be a pivotal part in my life where I found that inspiring. And that was happening at a time where, I found sort of solace in going fishing and being out in nature, because I didn't want to be at home, and I'm not a city person. I grew up in the suburbs. So somewhere between the city and the country, and, there's social and cultural things about living in the suburbs that aren't good sometimes for young adolescents that, get in trouble. And anyway, that, I think that planted a seed. So when I was also relatively young, so I'm the youngest of four, and some might say maybe I'm a mistake or whatever. My siblings are much older than I am. And by the time I came along, my parents were like blue collar family, like, saving money, struggling with some stuff. They decided, it was when I was 5, they wanted to do something adventurous, and we went to Andros Island. And that was back in 1973 when the Bahamas gained independence. I was just this little squirt, right? And we flew into Nassau, and then I remember flying into Andros on a Twin Otter, and half the island was on fire because there was like dry season. We still landed and hopped in this VW van, and we were like driving to the resort, a little lodge, Small Hope Bay Lodge. And we were like going through, and the driver jumped out with a piece of plywood to like smack off the fire to get the van going through. And I got there, I'm just like grew up in Canada as little kid. And that alone was pretty amazing experience. And then, my dad put a mask on my face and kind of shoved me in the water. I was like, holy crap, look at this really cool environment, the diversity. There was sharks, and, I'm pretty sure I saw tailing bonefish. Like it was pretty amazing. And that kind of, that I think that planted also that seed of my early connection to like a tropical marine environment and to diverse parts of the environment. And going back to Southern Ontario, we explored, and we ended up going to in my formative years as a teenager. I had this best friend, and that he's still my best friend. He's like my brother from another mother. His name's Dave, and I think everybody has a good friend Dave. But my good friend Dave is like he's the uncle to my kids, basically. His family was kind of like a surrogate family, a very important one. And they had a cottage up north of Lake Ontario, and we went fishing a lot. And it was at a time too. So during this transition, it's as I was getting more involved and more connected to fish in the environment, I was also becoming more aware around the Great Lakes about what a cesspool it was back then. Like, like all these super fun sites. And, when you're go fishing in Ontario, even back then, and I think it's like that now, you get this big guidebook that shows you like where it's safe to harvest fish and what size of fish is hard to harvest because of like PCBs and, all these other toxic stuff that's in the environment. And so, it was at this intersection when I was like trying to find my path out of high school, which I barely got out of because just of, long story, but barely made it out of high school, got into university and got onto a path where I could focus really intensely on fish. And one, because of like, I love them so much and they were such an important part of my life and they are still such an important part of my life. And two, I saw a path where, boy, if they're so important, how can we keep like screwing up their environment and screwing them up? And maybe there's a part of this path for me to be on where I could use my energy and my passion to like positively affect change through science and all that other stuff. And going back to your question about like a mentor or a catalyst. So, right, there was Jacques Cousteau. There's like my buddy Dave, where we got connected into this visceral connection to fish. And then I had a mentor during my undergraduate. His name was Michael Barrow, and he was one that kind of encouraged me to go to this particular university. And he was pretty good about the philosophically thinking about why you're doing what you're doing. Like, is this a day job? Like, what are you thinking about this for a career path? What's this broader purpose? And do you have a broader purpose and how do you want to affect change? And at that time he was writing a book. And I won't swear on the podcast, but his working title for it initially was Famous Fishery F-Ups. And it was book that basically went through and it was the prologue is written by David Suzuki, who was a famous Canadian conservationist, environmentalist. And it basically went through and it was a catalog of all these different ways that for as much as we love fish and from a commercial standpoint, a recreational standpoint, all these other things, that like there are these famous fishery F-ups that like, here's how we overlooked these important aspects about fish and the environment. And here's why the cod stocks collapse. And here's why tuna stocks are collapsing. And here's why salmon stocks are collapsing. And so that, having that time to sit with that mentor and to philosophize with him, to think about my place on this planet, if I'm going to like use my energy to positively affect change, like to go down that path, I think that was kind of like the foundation for the steps that I continue to take. And it's never a straight line, right? Like you think you have these career goals and, you don't have a long enough podcast for me to go into all that stuff. But anyway, so, there was these people, I think that, and these experiences, like I think we sometimes think as mentors, as individuals, sometimes I think mentors or pivotal moments of these experiences and these things that you kind of grab onto that make you realize that what you're doing has purpose. And I see that even more now that I have two, young kids, not that young, 12 and 15, but, that purpose and thinking about their future and their future on this planet and for good or bad, they like to fish, obviously, and they like to be outside and they like to explore. And so, I think that as a person on this planet, as an academic, as somebody that has connections to, the fishing industry and other platforms to help to, spread not just my voice, but like hopefully my philosophy that maybe we'll create more of this catalyst for change so that, we have fish and healthy aquatic ecosystems and a healthy planet to live on in the future.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I think it's, myself included, I would at least, totally different way of going about doing it, but kind of the same fuel for the and passion, is that, I think at the end of the day, people protect what they love. And when you find something, and for me, it was fishing, and it was for you too, that I just totally latched onto that. I was like, man, I can't just take from the resource. I need to be able to do something to give back to it. And so it's always inspiring to talk to people who have not only sort of had that passion, but then found a way to make a living protecting what they love. And I think that's really cool. But everything that you just sort of said is actually a pretty good segue for kind of one of the next things that I wanted to talk about, which is, like you had mentioned earlier, like I am kind of curious about the effects of the paper mills on fish, just because we have quite a few paper mills in Georgia and South Carolina, but just different environmental threats, right? I mean, you could, that's so broad that it's like, well, depends on what you want to talk about. But because I mean, right, there's everything. There's runoff from fertilizer, excuse me, there's climate change, there's habitat destruction, there's things that I have never really thought about, but paper mills and just all sorts of crazy stuff. So can, just for my own curiosity, what was the paper mill situation? How did that research?
Yeah, so we were looking at how fish were being affected upstream and downstream of a big paper mill up in New Brunswick, and we're monitoring a couple different species upstream and downstream, and seeing how it was really affecting their metabolism and their growth rates, and impacting essentially their reproductive potential. And so, a lot of the things that come out of pulp and paper mills, not only is there like nutrient enrichment and all this other stuff that we know is bad, but there can be some chemicals that are coming out of pulp and paper mills in the effluent that can have pretty significant effects on fish physiology and their ability to maintain their populations, their ability to grow. There's I teach about this a lot in a sophomore level conservation class at UMass here that has grown a lot in the last 10 years. There's lots of things that, and you mentioned it, there's a lot of things that like were put in the environment that 5 years ago we thought were benign that are not benign now. Like the more that we learn about what we put into the environment, and we dig it, we ignore a lot of the work that needs to be done ahead of time to understand what the impacts are. And that goes to anything, right? Like I think where we as human societies get into trouble is where we don't look carefully enough and patiently enough about the effects of things that we're putting in the environment, or how we're changing the habitat, or what the effects are. And obviously the big elephant in the room is climate change. And you talked about, water flow and change, like a lot of that, right? A lot of the impacts that we're seeing now, are actually being exacerbated by other things that are happening related to climate change. Like we should no longer use the word global warming, right? It's climate change. And yes, we're seeing increasing temperatures. We're seeing global temperatures increase, but it's not only just temperature that's causing the problem, right? We're seeing changes in precipitation regimes, extremes between droughts and floods, and a lot of that has cascading effects about how resilient aquatic ecosystems are, and fish are, and the planet is, right? Like the more times that you are kicked and pushed down, the harder it is to keep getting up, right? And so I think that's kind of like the analogy I use for like what we're doing to our planet. Like we're these subtle little impacts here and there might be some ways for the environment to respond or be resilient to. And what we're really doing right now is we're pushing the resiliency of our planet to the point where it may not be that resilient anymore, right? And so, when it comes to, well, I think I sort of answered your question there, but I could ramble on about resiliency. But I think that idea of these sort of cascading effects, and then bringing it back to this idea of and I know you and I were going to chat about this, about like not being apathetic, right? Like we gotta there as and I think you and I know this individually, like we're continuing to fight the good fight, and we need to stay sort of optimistic about how we can create positive change. And I think that, sometimes that's hard given, stuff we see in the popular media and the stuff that we're, experiencing. Like right now, I'm in Massachusetts, and, it's like spring out. It's like the middle of March. There's no snow. We've had a really lame winter. And, some of the plants are starting to bud out, which is like a month early. Right. And so I'm seeing that, like I think that having those observations are important, and recognizing that there's change happening in my backyard. And I think that's what I would kind of encourage other people to do. I'm like, there's things that are happening around you that are important to be aware of, and to have that be that personal set of experiences that guides you to like, oh my God, like climate change is real. And, there are things in place that we can do to slow it down. And even though climate change is that big elephant in the room and sometimes seems daunting, there are other things that we can do as individuals and as groups and as communities and as industries, for other parts of the environment and other aspects where we can help our environment maintain that resiliency as we're fighting that bigger fight against climate change. And I think that's where like I try to work with my students, and I try to work with anybody that'll listen. I'm like, don't give up. And they're like, what can I do? I'm like, oh, well, that's why you practice, you follow the 3 principles for keep fish wet, right? And with each fish you encounter, you minimize air exposure, you reduce impact, you don't reduce impacts on rough surfaces, and you minimize handling time, because there's some science that shows that creates a better outcome for each fish. And if all the fish that are back being released are in better condition, then that makes those populations more resilient as we're fighting these other fights related to climate change and habitat and other stuff.
Well, too, just, talking about climate change, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released their 6th report, which is basically a summary of the first 5. And it was nothing new, but it was just something that's really important to me personally for everyone to understand, is that you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And nothing is more empowering than actually taking action and doing something, whether it's keeping fish wet, or, hey, I'm going to switch the bulbs in my house to LED because it's going to help me conserve energy, or, whatever the step is. Like and literally the report says this, like at this point, every action matters. Like, so like 100 pennies make a dollar. So it's like, I can't personally stop big oil, right? But I can conserve energy. I can make a personal decision to conserve energy, or put solar on my roof, or whatever the case may be, to help lessen my impact. Well, if millions of people do that, then the impact is huge.
Yeah. And you can modify how you vote, and you can modify, there are other things that you can do.
Yeah.
And, I think I really, what you said there resonates really well with me. And I would make one change and say that we're all the problem.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's, I think we're, you know, this is where I go back to being like, you know, being to keep fish wet and catch and release. We're the problem. If we hold fish out of the water longer, they're going to suffer. Right. We're also the solution. You don't take them out of the water, you know, like, and so, you know, I think that once we acknowledge that, you know, and it's really climate change, habitat disturbance, coastal development, the fact that we've got more demands on oil and all this other, it's the weight of humanity. Right. And, you know, I interviewed for a documentary a number of years ago, Sandy Moret, and, you know, during that interview, he, you know, he said that it's like, we were talking about the Florida Keys and he's like, well, you know, it's really just the weight of humanity. And that resonates with me a lot on a regular basis, because, you know, it's the fact that we've got so many people that are, you know, part of the human societies, which are great. And I'm not against thinking about humans are important parts of the planet. But a lot of the things that we do are creating the impacts that we're seeing. Yeah. And it's when you ask, you know, rather than one, look, we got to look at ourselves in the mirror and recognize that we're part of the problem. And we then ask ourselves, do we want to continue to be part of the problem? Or do we want to start going down the path where we can be part of the solution? And like you were saying about LEDs, or like, you know, getting rid of the ditching the hero shot and the grip and grin, like cut that crap out. And, you know, that's going to create, you know, positive change. And it's simple behavioral stuff. We're not talking about like, you know, and there's so many state incentives for like switching out to LEDs, right? All it takes is a tiny little bit of extra time and a commitment. And you've got, you know, places where they'll give you rebates, or they'll give you to them for free, you know, and so.
Hey, I'm sorry, I have to. Yeah. I have to do this before, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah, it's all good.
There is a website. There's a link actually through the Fly Fishing Climate Alliance.org website, but it's the database. It's DSIRE. The easiest way to do it is just go to flyfishingclimatealliance.org and click on this resource, and you can literally type in your zip code, and it will tell you whether you're an individual or a business, every state and federal tax incentive, rebate, like anything you can think of to conserve energy or move forward with renewables or electric vehicles. It's a really cool resource, and I wanted to mention that before interrupt you for that, because it's super helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome that that's there. And what it does is it reduces the distance between wanting to be part of the solution and being part of the solution, right? And so, you know, we all have, I think, as going it back to anglers and, you know, conservation-minded anglers and thinking about the future and protecting what we love, you know, there's some good intentions there, right? Like, we don't want to see fishing disappear. You know, we know that stocking fish is expensive and it's polluting genetic resources, and it's like, stocking is not a solution. It's not economically viable. You know, like, we think about how we find those things where we can make positive change, and starting it with like the minimal amount of effort. We know everybody's got busy lives, and you know, like, and people are stressed out and all that stuff. But if we all as individuals, anglers or not, make a tiny little bit of a commitment to make that behavioral change, turn the lights off in your room before you leave the room and not leave them on for a long time, or put timers on your lights, or do whatever, like, it all adds up. And I think that, you know, that I think, and that also, like, if once you start, it's habit forming, right? And once you know, and this is where I go back, you know, Sasha and I talk about this a lot, about how the best practices for catch and release and keep fish wet is kind of like a gateway to having other conversations about bigger environmental issues like habitat and climate change, right? If you can work with anglers and have them understand that, like, a tiny little bit of a behavioral change that doesn't cost them any money is going to, man, make a huge outcome on that, the health and well-being of that fish when it's released. One, why wouldn't you want to do it? Right. And two, all of a sudden it empowers you to think like, wow, okay, that little bit of behavioral change, man, I'm empowered. I made a difference. Well, maybe I can make a difference the next time I plan my route to drop off stuff and not use so much gas, or think about the next time I see an ad about incentives for light bulbs or whatever. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take the 5 minutes and I'm going to click that and I'm going to sign up for it and I'm going to get those LED bulbs. I think that there's that gateway to having that conversation, and to also how to share your views and your voice where it comes to lobbying for policy change. I think there's a lot that can be done. And I think that we just need to find ways to keep up that momentum. And, and it could be sector by sector, like we're talking, a lot related to recreational fishing, right? Maybe this is a bit of a tangent, or a not even a tangent or a digression, but fish rely on water, right? Like water. Like when I started teaching this course at UMass about fish conservation, there wasn't like a module about water. It just jumped into fish. I'm like, how can you teach a course about fish and not understand the principles of water? There's a lot of people that talk about water conservation and water pollution and things like that, and ecosystems and components in water. But like, I know this is audio and people can't see it, but if I take my little cup of water here and I pour water on the floor, I'm not conserving water, but there's nothing in that water that's like screaming or dying. You can't quite see it. And I think this is where I think fish are really invaluable as like that sort of very relevant, real, it's not abstract. These things that rely so heavily on the water quality, that using them as a vehicle, almost as a canary in the coal mine, and also as the thing that so many of us rally around, right? We love to fish. We love that experience. It's saved our lives. We fish with our kids. We fish with our grandparents. There's competitions. There's all sorts of reasons why fish are so important. People like to eat fish, if they're legal to harvest fish. I like to eat fish, but thinking about ways that we can amplify the importance of fish, that connection to water, and the connection to things that are changing in the environment, temperature, flow regimes, like it just makes it that much more relevant. And maybe, at least in our circles with recreational anglers, it maybe gives people that extra little nudge and say, you know what, I'm going to, as of today, I'm going to be part of the solution, and I'm going to start making a change. And whether it's how I'm interacting with my fish, or how I'm writing letters to my local mayor or constituents about things that are happening in my backyard related to water flow or pollution or whatever, like everybody needs to step up, right? It's time to, when we have these issues that we're facing, you got to lean into them, right? And if you don't lean into them, then, you're not pushing against the negative stuff that's happening.
Right. And I think too, a component of it is, it's as simple as just starting to ask questions, right? I mean, otherwise, like, what are you, like, I don't know. I just feel like as anglers, you're kind of by nature curious and wanting to learn, right? Because you started and you were like, okay, well, whether it was entomology for trout and understanding that, which, by the way, I think is an awesome crash course in systems thinking, or if you're soaking bait, or like you're starting to understand that it's part of a system, and then it's like, all right, well, I love this, I want to protect it. Then I feel like the next step is like, well, what can I do? And then just keep asking questions, and it's okay to question anything, right? But it's like, I think that's the path that you go on to come to the realization that it's like, oh, well, Yeah. All right. Well, what is my impact on climate? Or what can I do? Or what is my impact on fish? Oh, well, hey, look, here's a resource. Keep fish wet. Here's these things that I can do that I can control, that I can personally control.
Yep.
And because there's so much that's outside of our control, but that's stuff that you can control.
Yep.
Which I think is really important. And as anglers who benefit, I guess is the right word, from fishing and the resource, we do have a responsibility to protect it and give back.
Yeah. Well, and it's conservation, right? I think people get lost on like the term conservation. Conservation is like, it's that idea of sustainability. It's like conserving it for future use, right? Preservation is like, we're not going to touch it, we're not going to use it, and we're just going to let it be. And there's some places where we need to preserve, areas that are sensitive and stuff. But like the idea of conservation is that acknowledgement is like, we use things on our planet. We just do. You've got wood in your house. You've got water coming out your pipes. We've got, those other things. Like we use natural resources, and we need to be wise about how we're using those natural resources. We need to change some of the models about how we use those natural resources, like thinking about regenerative agriculture, about how you create systems where you're not depleting the soils to the extent where they can never be used again or need to be fertilized and all that stuff. Actually planting and doing things where it's regenerative, where like it's much more sustainable from year to year in terms of the productivity of those crops. We got to get away from thinking about how we other things for advocating for change, like the way that we're messing around with forage fish, and depleting forage fish stocks, for fish oils, where we know that there's advancements in alternatives to fish oils. I'm starting to do some collaboration with a company that's producing something called ahi flour, which is an oil. It's oil from a weed that actually has some of, and actually is comparable to fish oil. Right. So we don't have to be like, and I won't get into the details, and that's like a topic of another podcast. But like looking at alternatives where, you're looking at ways that you're minimizing the impacts on the environment. You're looking at value added opportunities to take wastes, to use them into products that we'd normally be taking out of the environment for other purposes. I think there's some really cool approaches where I think we need to break the mold. We got to get past the model where single-use plastic water bottles and the way, monoculture, in terms of agriculture. And there's lots of things we could keep going on a massive list where like we need to start taking bigger steps and looking at these alternative ways of doing things, with the provision that like the environment is really at stake. And if the environment's at stake, so is our health and well-being and our future. So I think that's important to, and I think that's kind of where, in some ways it can get a little daunting where people are like, oh my God, I'm so busy. And some of these things are so big, I'm not going to be able to make change, or my little change in my voice and change in action is not going to have an effect. But if you have enough people coming to the table, pushing that agenda, that alternative agenda, and that agenda for positive change and personal responsibility, and looking for smart alternatives that are less impactful to the environment, yet and also give back in the same way and help rejuvenate the environment. Man, that's where we got to go.
Well, and I think something too. It's progress or positive impact isn't like this straight line, right? Where it's moving in one direction. It's taking steps, and sometimes, hey, look, it's not about perfection, I guess is what I'm saying. I, for the most part, carry around a reusable water bottle and coffee, but I'm a human being. Like, yeah, sometimes I forget and I got to go get a plastic water bottle because I'm in the airport. Like, I left it. I was busy packing. Like, it's not about being perfect. It's about taking those steps and being like, oh yeah, well, next time I'll remember, and that's okay. Yep. Like, and not to beat yourself up about it, even though I really do hate doing that. But there was, you mentioned this earlier, and I have to say, I want to make sure that we get to this because I have so many questions.
Sure.
But you mentioned Sandy Moret and Florida Keys.
Yep.
Legend, right?
Yep.
And I'm going to the Keys for a couple of tarpon trips, one in May and one in June.
Cool.
And I'm super stoked and kind of, I should say, me and my friends that grew up together in Savannah, me and my buddy Brent Watts, he and I for 5 years went to the Everglades and just did DIY. We trailered his little boat, and after 5 years, we caught one tarpon. Like, we didn't have guides. we were figuring it out, but I mean, that was super fun. We were camping and doing that whole deal, but just going and exploring, which was awesome. But last year, we did get some guides and, landed and safely released and kept the tarpon wet.
Sweet.
Some tarpon. And so now I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm super stoked. So, I want to talk about, because they're just on my mind nonstop right now. The work that you're doing with BTT, and also some of the work that y'all have done in the past, which I don't think, I didn't know this until I started getting into it. But tarpon, we would not have known this without the research that was done. And I'll let you expand on it. But I mean, they migrate like way farther north than people thought originally. Like,
yes, no, that's an awesome segue. And I'm the same with you about tarpon. I think they're an amazing species, as are most of the flat species. It's something that I just gravitate towards. So tied back to tarpon and movement, back in 2016. So my lab, we get a lot of funding from BTT, and we collaborate with Bonefish and Tarpon Trust a lot. And so we received a grant to basically spearhead their tarpon telemetry project. So that was back in 2016. And that project basically entailed putting surgically implanting transmitters in tarpon with a battery life of about 5 years, and using acoustic receivers, which are in the water. So we had a whole bunch in the Florida Keys, and then there are a whole bunch of other researchers with receivers up and down the eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's these data sharing agreements that, if you detect my tarpon on your receiver, we'll get access to that data. It's a really, really cool collaborative project. So anyway, over the course of 4 or 5 years, we surgically implanted transmitters in about 200 tarpon, and followed their movement patterns from year to year. And what's different about this approach is that you're following the same individuals from year after year for multiple years. There were other tarpon tagging projects using satellite tags, which are amazing for tracking fish, but they don't stay on for very long. And then you end up piecing this story together with what did Bob and Mary and Joe and Jim, their combined tracks, what can that tell you about the overall population? So you're not looking at what individuals were doing year after year after year. You're sort of compiling individual movement patterns to paint this kind of broader picture. And so with this acoustic telemetry project, we're taking it to the next level by being able to follow those individuals over time, over multiple years. And the fact that these acoustic transmitters are about the size of like a AA battery, not the size of a plastic water bottle, and you surgically implant them in the fish, you could put them in smaller tarpon. The satellite tags you can only put on larger fish. So this acoustic telemetry project allowed us to look with a broader lens at what a wider size range of tarpon are doing year after year after year. And so, the long and short of the results, and there's still some tarpon that we're tracking multiple years after. So we tagged some of them in 2020. So we're still collecting data on those fish.
Okay.
And they're, like you were going down to go fish for tarpon in May, right? That's the season where they all sort of, and we know this, that's the tarpon season in the Florida Keys. They're all down there to basically, it's putatively to spawn, right? They form these spawning aggregations and then they go offshore to spawn. And once the season starts to wane, you get into June or July, a lot of those tarpon will start to migrate away from the Keys. But what our data is showing is that you've got some of those tarpon that mix in the Keys, that some of them always go up the Gulf Coast, and you've got some that always go up the Atlantic coast. And there's a few that maybe mix, but you've got these consistent patterns of sort of maybe these subgroups of tarpon that have different migratory behaviors. That, when we look at them, they all look the same. It's like basically that's the tarpon population or the tarpon stock, but their behaviors, their migratory behaviors are different. Layered into that is that because we're able to monitor the movement patterns of individual tarpon year after year, the same tarpon are following the same migratory patterns year after year. So the ones that always go up the East Coast, always go up the East Coast year after year. They're not like they decide one year that, I'm going to Alabama, they don't do that. And they also, the timing at which they arrive back in the Keys is plus or minus a week or two, right? Really? So the timing of arrival, yeah. So that's spread out over the season, but it means you're going down fishing in May, right, into the Florida Keys. So there's a high probability that if you went last May and you're going this May, you're fishing for the same group of fish, right? That still might be hundreds and hundreds of fish. But it means that timing of their migration as they're entering that population, as they're entering that environment in the Florida Keys, the timing of arrival and the timing of departure is pretty consistent year after year after year. Wow. Through this project, we've also demonstrated that they're going a lot further north than we ever thought, right? So we've gotten detections in the Chesapeake, right? Not a ton of fish, but that's starting to reflect back on a lot of the observations that we're getting from guides and people that are seeing more tarpon moving further north. But we're just, we're backing up those observations with this science, right? And saying, because, often if you want to go to a legislature or a legislator and you want to fight for change in terms of management, if you say, well, we're observing that this, or where's the numbers? Where's the data? Right. Well, this is the science that's bringing the data to the table to go, look, here's a proportion of fish that they all sort of congregate in the Florida Keys, but guess what? They're going further up for passing multiple state boundaries, and they're spending time in your state waters. So as we bring that science, and BTD's tagline, bring the science to the fight, right? As we bring that science, that those numbers to the fight, it just adds weight to the argument that for the management of tarpon, it has to be regional, right? We can't do it state by state, right? There's still some states where it's legal to harvest tarpon, and there's still some states where there isn't any regulations about taking big fish out of the water, right? In Florida, if it's over 40 inches or 44 inches, I can't remember, you can't take the fish out of the water because that has, implications for internal organs and all sorts of stuff, in addition to not keeping the gills in the water. But they're having this movement data, this data about migratory patterns and about individual repeatability year after year, and and how it's putting certain portions of the population in areas where there might be other threats that are happening, not just harvest, but also what if these tarpon, believe, and other people believe, that they're moving north to follow the mullet runs, right? And go to Menhaden to, after these spawn, they move north to basically fatten up their fuel resources to then migrate back south to go spawn again the following year. So if they're following all these mullet runs and these bunker populations to go feed, and those bait fish populations are dependent upon freshwater input in these estuaries, right? And we're impacting freshwater flows in these estuaries, then there might be some sort of threat as the tarpon are spending more time or migrating north. It may be exposing them to other impacts that affect their populations. And so having this information about movement patterns has actually led to the current study that's using stable isotopes. So with taking little fin clips, and essentially, long story short, you are what you eat. And there's some things that we can tell from the stable isotopes in the fish's body about where it is on the food chain and how much time it's spending in fresh water versus salt water. That's the next step to these movement patterns and these migration patterns, is making the connections to the prey base so that we can bring even more evidence to the table when we want to work with legislators and managers about this broader regional plan for protecting, or conserving tarpon, right? So long story short, we still have tarpon stuff going on. We're still tracking tarpon that were tagged as part of the earlier study. And then now we're doing the stable isotope work as an extension of that. Yeah. Based on the clues that or based on the data that we derive from the acoustic telemetry stuff.
That is that's so fascinating to me. That is so cool. And I think too, kind of said this earlier, but it's applies here too. And thinking about systems thinking, right? Of like, this is part of a system. We're all working within that same system, and in some capacity, and or in every capacity, really. But particularly, with these tarpon, if they're chasing these smaller fish or bait fish, and there's impacts on that, then that bait fish is just as important as the tarpon, even though you could put economic numbers behind what tarpon fishing brings to the state of Florida for those 2 months, and all that. But the point is that they're no less valuable, and I guess you could argue perhaps even more valuable to sustain the population over the long term. But I guess a follow-up question, and it may be tarpon related, it may be not, but I have to ask because you've been researching, for 20 plus years, right? What are maybe some of the most profound findings from your research and it can be about anything, but just curious, what has surprised you, I guess, in your research?
Yeah, over the last 20 some odd years, I think there's a ton. It's all, to me, I'm driven just by the stuff that I learn, and fish are just so freaking cool. I think one of the biggest things was so I spearheaded the first study that documented where bonefish go to spawn. And that was in the Bahamas and Eleuthera. There's a whole bunch of wonderful collaborators involved in that, including BTT. And that knowledge has been the springboard for a lot of other work that's been done to help set up protected areas in the Bahamas, to help understand their biology and ecology. That was a big discovery. That was one of those cool discovery moments. I think that all the things that I'm doing related to some of the movement patterns, like the way that we've seen tarpon going much further north, I think that opens up the idea about broader regional management. That was, again, we kind of had that sense, but the science reinforced that.
Can I interrupt you, because I'm just because I'm curious.
Sure.
The them moving further north, is there evidence that has something to do with climate change and warming temperatures, or is there not enough to conclude that yet?
Yeah, anecdotally, probably. We're seeing more accounts, but if you go back historically, there are accounts of tarpon showing up occasionally, like in Martha's Vineyard, right? Yeah. Or, but I think over time, now that we're more aware and we're able to look at these things, we can see if that has created that change.
Yeah.
Other stuff that I find interesting, and I think that sort of that earth shattering or the bigger revelations. It's one part of a project that I was doing in the Seychelles about milkfish, but it's a reminder that we have to be careful about what we advocate on social media as anglers and our anecdotes. So there's this whole thing that milkfish fight for so long because they don't build up blood lactate. They don't build up the lactic acid, and they don't do that because they're vegetarians. Like literally twice a year on social media, I see that coming up over and over again. And I'm like, one, that's physiologically, biologically impossible. And, and although like milkfish aren't targeted very much by recreational anglers, if you look at how they're being promoted, more and more people want to go to catch milkfish, right?
Yeah.
And so we actually this time last year, or we went and did some science through the Alphonse Fishing Company. They're great collaborators. And we debunked that. We we actually used some science, and we said, look, that they build up blood lactate, and that we're looking at their duration at which they produce blood lactate. Anyway, long story short, to me, that was, to me, it was like, I wasn't surprised, but it's another example of like how, and I know this because I'm a recreational angler. I've got all these anecdotes of like why fish would behave in a certain way, and why does this fish fight longer than this fish? But it's another example of like, let's use science and let's to basically provide some validity to those hypotheses.
Right.
And so that when it comes to caring for each individual fish, whether it's milkfish or bonefish or brown trout or tarpon, that we can be more confident in the way that we're interacting with them as anglers. And we can be more confident about what we're advocating for. So this is kind of bringing it full circle in that, I totally believe in being a strong advocate and being an activist, right? Like, but what I believe in more is being an informed advocate, an informed activist. So you were talking about using that knowledge and learning about why a fish does this versus this, or why our habitat's degrading in this way versus that way. And then bringing that knowledge to the table when you're having a discussion with your fishing buddies, or when you're having an argument with a politician, or when you're writing a letter to your legislator, that you've got some evidence, you're informed, you're much more informed, and you're bringing evidence to the table that strengthens your argument. Yeah. And to me, that's where like I think that's where we all need to go. Rather than saying, well, I believe, like, great, we all believe in lots of different things. Yeah. I believe in this because here is some evidence that's showing, and some scientific evidence that's been objectively derived that's showing that milkfish produce blood lactate, so we can't and we shouldn't fight them for an hour and a half.
Yeah, right.
So,
right.
And so that's where like, and I think that applies across the board. Again, whether you're an angler or not, thinking about the ways that we lean into problems, thinking that we're one part of the solution, and leaning into it in a way where, if you want to be the solution, you base your actions on objective evidence in terms of knowing that so you feel confident that, going back to keep fish wet, I feel confident if I don't take a fish out of the water, it's probably not physiologically impacted as much. So I'm not going to take the fish out of the water. Or if I am, it's going to be for 2 seconds or 1 second because the science shows that 10 seconds or less is okay. And so, that guides my personal behavior, but it also guides how I advocate for change within the recreational angling community, right? So I bring that scientific evidence to the table, and can point to that evidence and say, and at the end of the day, when it comes to recreational fisheries, so what's the harm? Like when it comes to catch and release and best handling practices. So, there's never going to be a study that shows that taking the fish out of the water is good, right? So, and then if we love these fish so much, then why shouldn't we all try to adopt these best practices for catch and release with each fish? And yes, we all make mistakes. You're right. Every once in a while, fish falls out of your hands or you forget or stuff. We're all human, but it's that then after you do that, you look introspectively and go, I'm going to do it better next time.
Yep.
I'm going to try not to forget my reusable water bottle, but today I'm dehydrated. So I unfortunately need to get that single use bottle, because that's where I am and I don't want to get sick. So I think there's that broader ethos of sort of personal responsibility and thinking about how that reflects back on the evidence that we bring to the table as we decide to make positive change, and then how we advocate for positive change to our neighbors, to our kids, to the people that you interact with, to fellow anglers, to whoever wants to listen, right? So
is that, would you say, or I guess I'll just ask, what is it that, we talked about this a little bit before the interview, but it's with your research and things that are, climate change and pollution and all sorts of stuff that it's can be a little, can kind of get you down, I guess. Yep. So what is it that gives you hope about the future?
What gives me hope is that that there's lots of examples of making those little changes that create positive change, that's a positive difference to make, right? And if you do the math, if you look at examples of how subtle changes in behavior have catalyzed and created positive change, and also, if we don't lead with hope and optimism, the opposite is pessimism and apathy. And if we do that, we're screwed, right? And at the end of the day, I also, maybe this is broader, deeper in terms of, than we need to go. But maybe humans are on this planet, in geological time, just for a small bit of it.
Right.
I think, I tell this to my students. So if we weren't here, the trees, the forest, the fish would all be fine.
Yeah.
They'd be, and so, this is where a lot of, and maybe this is a bit of a digression, but a lot of the work that I do now with recreational fisheries is not only doing science, but I also do social science. I collaborate with social scientists to understand, how do we change social norms? How do we create behavioral change in such a way that, that ultimately, because we don't manage fish and we don't manage trees, right? We manage people. That's what we do, right? It goes back to tragedy of the commons. It goes back to cheating and stealing and competing for resources. And so, that if we go into that mindset that we're managing people, we need to understand what makes people tick and what drives their motivations. And we need to work with them to help, positively affect change social norms. And there's enough where, that there's enough there that I think we can lead with hope and optimism. And I think that there is a bright future we got to start now. Right. So,
yeah. No time like the present. All right. Well, let me, before we wrap up, we've been talking about fish. We've been talking about conservation, science, and this is all. And by the way, we might have to do a part 2 because this has done nothing but get like more. I have more questions, but
It's all good.
But that being said, we haven't necessarily talked a ton about fishing. So I'm going to ask favorite. This is loaded, so maybe I should break it down.
That's all right.
Saltwater species and favorite freshwater species to catch on any kind of gear. It doesn't matter if it's or whatever.
I want to start with saying that for me, every fish is my favorite.
Yeah,
that's fair. And it's true. I honestly, to have that conversation. So, I love bonefish. Bonefish to me, they're fabulous in terms of the way they fight. And, the first fish that I ever caught in a fly rod is a bonefish. I taught myself how to fly fish, and I caught it on a fly that I tied myself. So it's hard to go back from that. Yeah. But, bonefish are great, but, from tarpon are cool, permit are cool, golden masseur are cool, trout are cool, bass are cool. Like I don't see it like this. To me, the fish are part of the puzzle when you combine it into the environment and you combine it into the experience. Right. Honestly, I mean, I've got, your listeners can't see it, but I have a big golden dorado behind my head in my office. I love golden dorado for what they are and how they fight and how cool they are. But would I rank them higher than GTs, or would I rank them higher than golden masseur, or would I rank them higher than the little sunfish that I catch on my 10-car rod in my local pond? Probably not, because I just think, I don't know, I just enjoy my interactions with each and every fish, like it, because I don't know, maybe that's not the best answer or what maybe your listeners were hoping for, but like I don't I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't have favorites. Yeah. And I think that by doing that, I think I don't know, maybe I look more broadly about how important fish are, even those fish we don't catch on hook and line, those little menhaden or the little darters that are in the stream near me that support that ecosystem. Yeah. Like every fish is cool in my mind. So,
yeah. All right. Well, where can anyone listening who is looking for some resources, maybe, to be it's the name of the podcast, a more sustainable angler or responsible angler.
All over the place. There's a ton. You can, like, we talked a lot about Keep Fish Wet. They're an important resource for best practice for catch and release. BTT's got some great stuff on their website. American Fly Fishing Trade Association's got a campaign called Tomorrow's Fish. There's comes a lot of resources there. Yeah. You can also, I've got a lab website. It's fishforward.org that has a lot of stuff on it and my contact information so people can reach out to me. And I also encourage people, like, if you've got questions about your favorite species or something that's going on about the environment around you, I've done a lot, both in freshwater, coastal, marine systems, lots of different species. Like, I don't have, it might take me a day or two or a week to respond to your email, but like, shoot me a question. I think that type of engagement is really important. And that's actually a lot of the questions that I've received from anglers and guides and lodges has actually been the catalyst for some of my research. Because that there's no better way to have people like buy into the results of a study if the questions come from them and it's relevant to the future of their fishery. Then let's have that conversation. So.
See, now you got me going again. See, we're doing a part 2. This is, I've got, because now I'm like, all right, well, hang on. I want to talk about redfish now because they're in my background. But anyway, we will do a part 2. And if you're open to it, and
absolutely,
I appreciate everything that you do and have done. Your research has fascinated me for a long time. The bonefish spawning in the Bahamas was really cool. Finding out that these tarpon are headed north, but I guess confirming it with data.
Yep, absolutely.
Saying, hey, this is what they're doing and this is their behavior, and that information helps us to better protect them because we know what's happening. And so anyway, on a personal note, thank you for everything that you do with your research to protect what you love, and thanks for your time and for joining me on the podcast. This was super informative, and that's why I like doing this. I just like to learn as much as I can. So I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Rick. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Sustainable Angler. Special thanks to Andy for his time and insights. If you like what you're hearing, really helps out the podcast if you could give it a rating and review on iTunes. Helps us to grow and educate more anglers and hopefully inspire more anglers to protect the planet. We have some merchandise, and we're going to be launching some new merchandise I'm pretty excited about. So stay tuned, and all of that can be found on our website, www.thesustainableangler.com.